I'm Brandon McDaniel, and today I'll be presenting Stephen Mithen's The Singing Neanderthals, chapters 3 and 4. So this lecture has to start with the understanding that the place where both music and language actually happen is the brain. This is the place where language is manufactured and understood, and where great works of music arise and are heard. It's a physical organ, and to be crude for a moment, it's a piece of meat. For us to understand any human behavior, including language, we have to understand what's going on in this incredibly complex piece of meat. And that's what Stephen Mithen's attempting to do in chapters 3 and 4. And before we get into the meat of what he actually talks about in chapters 3 and 4, we have to look at what a double dissociation is. So a double dissociation is where two different behaviors can exist without one another if there are brain damages to certain areas of the brain. So if music and language are developmentally independent and evolutionarily independent of one another as behaviors, then we would expect if there were damage to language areas of the brain, music may still exist. And if there were damage to areas of the brain that process music, that people might retain their language ability. That's what double dissociation is. And if a behavior is doubly dissociated, then people who study evolutionary psychology generally take that as a sign that they're developmentally and evolutionarily independent of one another. So Stephen Mithen explores this with several medical case studies throughout chapters 3 and 4 of the book. And we start by looking at two key brain areas. And the brain areas that are associated with language are Broca's area and Wernicke's area. They're both located on the central left cerebral hemisphere, and these areas of the brain are known to be associated with language because lesions on these brain areas result in language deficits. If lesions occur on Broca's area, the result is often a condition known as Broca's aphasia, and that's where a person can't understand language, a person can understand language, but they can't reproduce it themselves. They can't speak. If lesions occur on Wernicke's area, the results are a condition known as Wernicke's aphasia, where a person can speak, but the words are jumbled and they don't form coherent sentences. They're essentially word salad. These are not the only areas of the brain associated with language, and there are cases of global aphasia that often involve a much broader area of the brain. So we know that language networks are distributed widely throughout the brain, and they're not limited to Broca's area and Wernicke's area. But we do know that Broca's and Wernicke's area specifically house parts of the brain that are important for language. So, in chapter 3, Mithen explores music without language. So cases of aphasia, which is the loss of speech and language ability, but the retention of musical ability. Aphasia doesn't necessarily mean amusia. We start with the case study of Vissarion Shabalin. If music and language have evolved into two distinct mental processes, we would expect to see musical ability remain unaffected by trauma to the areas of the brain that process language. Vissarion Shabalin provides an interesting case study, illustrating that there are significantly different brain areas that process music and language. He was a composer that had studied music from a young age, and he suffered 2 strokes that affected his left temporal lobe. That resulted in a decimated language capacity, which is to say global aphasia. He couldn't speak, and he couldn't understand language when he was spoken to. And yet, he was able to complete his 5th symphony, while completely unable to speak or understand language. He was also a composition teacher at a university, and he continued to see students throughout that time. He was unable to give them lessons verbally, but what he would have them do is he would have them give them their compositions, and he would edit them with his pen because he could still process music and write music and read music, but he just couldn't talk about it. And his 5th Symphony was praised by Shostakovich as a brilliant creative work. So that's evidence for separate brain areas for music and language, definitely, because if you completely lose your ability to speak and you're still able to produce what Shostakovich would call a brilliant creative work, there are clearly some separation in the brain between music and language. Another case study was that of NS. He was a stroke victim who lost his ability to understand speech, but he retained his ability to speak. So he couldn't understand what other people were saying to him, but he could actually talk himself. And he could understand it if they wrote it down. So he could read. He just couldn't understand when people were talking to him. And he would also mistake environmental sounds for one another. So if he heard, the sound of a waterfall, he might mistake it for the sound of a fire, or other examples like that. The environmental sounds around him got confused. So the interesting thing about NS is that although he had no prior musical training, his musical ability increased. He took up musical instruments. He took an interest in going to concerts when he hadn't in the past. And this is further evidence for separate brain areas for music and language. Mithun goes on to look at other aphasia patients. Some were able to identify languages based on prosody but not understand the words, which is to say, when he heard different examples of people speaking, he could tell this is English, this is French, this is German, but he couldn't understand any of the actual words that were being said. And the rhythm ability was also affected. There were some cases where patients were able to identify instrumental timbres, while being unable to understand language. There were some cases where they were able to detect pitches, melody, and mood, and yet unable to understand language. And further evidence for this double dissociation or this independence between music and language is the fact that rates of recovery for musical, verbal, and environmental sound recognition in aphasia patients is different. So you can have a patient that had a stroke where they lost their ability to speak and understand language, and they were also affected by their ability to understand and recognize environmental sounds, and their musical ability was also affected, and they recover one faster than the other. And maybe their language ability completely recovers and their musical ability and environmental sound recognition ability remain low. And these differential rates of recovery provide further evidence for neural independence of these behaviors. Mithun concludes this chapter by talking about several cases of musical savants, which are cases where there's people with severe mental disabilities, including language disabilities, that retain significant musical aptitude, even enhanced musical aptitude compared with the general population. And several examples of those are outlined in the book, and that's also further evidence of this double dissociation. In the next chapter, Mithun goes into examples of amusia where there's no aphasia, so language without music. And he starts with the case of Maurice Ravel, who later in his life suffered from brain degeneration, which resulted in mild aphasia. So he had some brain degeneration, and he was mildly affected with his ability to speak and understand language. But worse for Ravel, he was no longer able to write music. So he had music in his head, but he couldn't get it out onto the page. He was quoted as saying, "This opera is in my head. I hear it, but I'll never write it." And this is a case where he retained his language ability, but his musical ability in the form of writing was affected. Another case study was that of H.J. H.J. was never trained in reading or writing music, but he was an amateur musician. So he played piano and he played other musical instruments, and he sang. And after some brain damage, his ability to play piano and these other musical instruments deteriorated. But what's important for our purposes is to understand that it was not a motor coordination issue. So his ability to play piano didn't deteriorate because his muscles were having a hard time moving. He performed perfectly well on tests of motor coordination. So his motor coordination was just as good as it ever was, but his musical ability declined, which again goes to showing that music and language are independent, because he retained his language ability and was losing musical ability, and tests revealed damage to the right parietal lobe. In this patient, who was anonymous, they had a blood-filled tumor in their brain and suffered damage to their left superior temporal gyrus. And they did experience language disorders, but those language disorders recovered within 3 months, again with the differential recovery rates. But they also had amusia, and the amusia was permanent. And after that, they were unable to sing or play guitar, which they used to do. And they reported that the singing that they heard started to sound like shouting. So they couldn't even listen to songs on the radio anymore. Those songs had started to sound like noise. Other cases of amusia resulted in the loss of tonal knowledge. And here we're going to get into some interaction effects. This patient, GL, had 2 aneurysms in his right middle cerebral artery, and he had aphasia and amusia at first. And again, with the differential recovery rates, his language ability returned, but he couldn't enjoy music anymore. Although most components of his musical knowledge remained intact, but his tonal knowledge, his ability to identify tonal and pitch relationships, was severely impacted. Another patient, KB, had a stroke causing brain damage, and he too developed aphasia and amusia at first, but language recovered, leaving a slight decline in general intelligence, but the amusia was again permanent. And this amusia resulted in pitch and rhythm perception deficits. However, he was able to regain some of those musical abilities if the music he was engaging with had lyrics. So we're seeing here an interaction between music and language, showing that there are some times where music and language may be sharing some neural networks, maybe together at a certain point in the brain, because when you tie it to language, the musical ability comes back. Specifically, when the amusia results in a deficit in pitch contour, it's associated with deficits in speech prosody. So going back, this demonstrates that there's a point where music and language do share a neural network, and it looks like that is in the area of pitch and speech prosody, where those overlap. Because speech prosody involves modulation of pitch and speech sounds, where the pitch goes up and down. And musical pitch may share some of those properties. Some of this is covered in the research of Isabelle Peretz, who studied this phenomenon. In milder cases, we think of this as tone deafness. There's been some controversy over the years as to whether tone deafness is actually real. And tone deafness, in fact, is real, and the proper medical name for it is congenital amusia. In 2002, Isabelle Peretz conducted a study showing that a significant portion of the population shows sign of congenital amusia. And this is where musical skill in people with congenital amusia, this is where people have problems with pitch, where they have a very hard time identifying pitch relationships. Although this skill increases when the musical task involves words or lyrics versus tones alone. So people with congenital amusia are able to sing in pitch much more easily when they're singing words than when they're singing on blank syllables. And this is assumed to derive from an inability to recognize pitch generally. And it's also been shown, it's not written here, but it was also shown that people with congenital amusia that have a hard time recognizing pitch are also have a harder time recognizing speech prosody generally. So we're seeing that overlap between speech prosody and pitch perception. So for Mithin, all of these medical case studies add up to chapter 5, where he gets into the modularity of music and language. And the diagram you see in front of you right here is a modular model of musical processing developed by Isabelle Peretz. So according to her, all of these case studies can be explained through this module, where acoustic input comes in, and then the brain analyzes that input and separates it into these separate modules, either pitch organization or temporal organization, or acoustic to phonological conversion. And you see how all that's processed there. You can take a minute to pause the video to look at the step-by-step process right now if you like. So this explains some of these medical case studies, because if an area of the brain is damaged that involves any one of these particular modules or boxes, then that step in the process of acoustic analysis is going to be impacted. And it may impact music or speech in various ways, but the way it'll impact them is by cutting off whatever part of this process that brain area is involved in. And he also talks about these networks not being in specifically necessarily one particular area of the brain, that each of these mental modules is in fact widely distributed. So saying that contour analysis, for example, is a mental module doesn't mean that it's in one location in the brain. That could be a patchwork of neurons that are widely distributed throughout the brain that just happen to be associated with contour analysis. And if you damage one part of that network, then that module might go down. But it doesn't mean that module is only in one area of the brain. These neural networks are fairly widely distributed. And that's the long and short of chapter 5.